Okay, thank you everybody for coming. I'm gonna pose. We don't have a poster. This is it. I was gonna say yes. So I don't remember the precise title that we put for this. So we're gonna. It's essentially, yeah. I didn't write it down, so that's my bad. It's informal. We have 3 Brazilian guests, so in Brazil things are perhaps too informal. So I'm happy to present, the 3 speakers today. We have Frank Serrano and Ricardo Summa, who are at the Federal University in Rio, and Nathalie Marins, who is a postdoc at the University of Boston. I should say that Franklin always reminds everybody that he was not formally my teacher, but I want you to know that everything that you think that I say that it's incorrect, it's because of his influence. So he is responsible for all my mistakes, even if he's not responsible for having taught me that. So, Ricardo worked with Franklin. Both of them write fundamentally about macroeconomic issues from, broadly speaking, a Australian perspective. And Nathalie has been doing work fundamentally on international macroeconomics. So I'll shut up. They'll go in an order. They're going to talk about inflation and the monetary policy responses in the United States, globally, and to have a sort of a specific case in the periphery in Brazil and contrast those experiences. The first will be Franklin. So I'll give you a 5-minute warning and a 2-minute warning, and you have about 12 minutes. And I think I have they're open, should be open already.
Consequence of not following no warning.
That I don't know.
That's not.
Yes, I can say that didn't I open the other one? Is this you? Oh, I hope it's you. Yes, it is you. I didn't use PCs. I hate this. There you go. How do you move to just there? You should just move a little.
Microphone is a bit far from where I am.
But it should pick up.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. People don't hear me. I can get closer. Well, this presentation is based on this paper, which is of course much longer, and I won't have time to go into that. But it's very about this very recent debate in the US on what happened on the coming out from the pandemic with inflation. And I want to talk about that very peculiar thing happened, which are called quantity supply shocks, and played not only a very important role in the inflationary burst we have, but also in generating a lot of confusion on the debate. This is the main thing. It's not about inflation as such, but about the interpretation of inflation. Now, very quickly, start with the puzzle. Before the pandemic, there has been a long discussion in the US, and I'm talking more about the US, other places also, that the so-called new consensus has been under severe criticism, and simplifying a lot, 3 big things happened. First, that sort of a lot of people acknowledge that the unemployment rate is not a good indicator of labor market slack. There is no unique NAIRO in the US, especially because for the simple reason that many new jobs are taken by those not officially classed as unemployed. So there's very large changes in the participation rate, etc. You cannot know exactly. This has been sort of over time. There's a lot of research on that. Then the idea that although people use this acceleration is Phillips curve, that the memory of inflation is complete. Any inflationary shock lasts forever. In spite of that, empirically, it's obvious that persistence is partial, and this also became sort of consensus. And further that more, there's been a lot of discussion of secular stagnation, the influence of MMT, and the return, sort of a return of fiscal policy to a more prominent role, rather than just let the, as John Taylor says, let the automatic stabilizers do the thing and not worry about it. This before the pandemic. And prominent in that view was Larry Summers, Lawrence Ball, and Blanchard, among others. But I'm naming these three just to say that these three people were in favor of these changes, these amendments or changes in the new concept. Some of the main people. Now, this led to two things. First, a big change in the Federal Reserve that made what they call the new monetary policy framework that was only published and started before, but was only published in August 2020. The new thing was based on those things that came from academia. The new changes in the concepts were flexible average inflation target instead of having to hit it immediately. The not use the idea of a unique narrow and avoid premature tightening of monetary policy. In practice, recognizing the idea of partial inflation persists, the sense that you don't have to, often the shocks because of the partial persistence just die down by themselves. You don't need to do anything. The best policy is just wait and see. Now, this has been a big change that was planned before the pandemic. And of course, again, before the pandemic, there was all the proposed Democratic Party fiscal policies, Green New Deal, all the things that you know better, right? Now, as everybody knows, then the pandemic hit, and US monetary fiscal policies were very expansionary during the recession and after. And something strange happened, and nobody was expecting to be so strong. During the recovery, inflation increased substantially. It was unexpected by most people because Larry Summers was one of the few that had predicted high inflation, arguing that the demand stimulus was too big. Yeah. And then because of that, the Fed after March 22 starts rising rates sharply. And if you take just as a comparison point, Jay Powell's speech in Jackson Hole in August 22, like 2 years after saying one thing, it's very hawkish, full of Friedman quotes. So what happened? What happened to the critique of the new consensus? The new consensus sort of resurrected in August 22, 2 years later. Did the Fed abandon the new framework? Is there a unique narrow? In fact, Summers, Blanchard, and Ball, with other co-authors, the three I mentioned, said, yes, there is labor scarcity. That's why there is inflation. And they, to make matters worse, they said that something equivalent to the unique narrow increased. So it's even worse. It's not only the new consensus is more unfavorable. Now, the problem is there was no empirical evidence of a general labor partial shortage in this period. And initially, most importantly, real wages fell. How can you have labor scarcity in a neoclassical world when real wages fall? Not very obvious how it could happen. Then, because of that, people realized that it was not in the labor market a problem for inflation. But because prices increased so much, you have two alternative views. Many heterodox authors proposed a new interpretation, saying there was some greedy corporations practicing generalized price gouging, using the market power to raise prices. It's all a big autonomous increase in the property markets. Alternatively, other people like Benengo, Lavoie, Spirati, and others said, no. What happens that was a pass-through of what I call here price supply shocks, like international commodity prices and other things that increased. And because even Benengo adds if they had all this market power, why didn't they increase the markups before? That's really not a very good explanation for what happened. You know the prices increased. Now, this price supply shocks view, just saying that, we had a lot of problems that happened during the pandemic. And from the point of view of the American economy, this rising oil price, food price, chip prices is what I call a price supply shock. Like the stuff you import becomes more expensive. And Matthias, for instance, adds that capacity utilization in the US was not high in general. So no shortage of labor, no shortage of fixed capital, but rising prices of the inputs. Because of that, because this idea of no scarcity, and it was a cost push inflation, both the profit inflation view and the price supply shock view say that demand had no effect on this new burst of inflation, not caused by demand in any way. And therefore, monetary tightening was excessive and unnecessary. It would only lead to recession and unemployment. Now, this is a well-known story, but there are problems with these three views. The first view, of course, there was no scarcity of labor. However, neither the profit inflation nor the price supply shock view explains the fact that in the case of the US, initially profit margins increased in several sectors, particularly in sectors producing durable goods. So just to make clear the most important point, the price of the microchip increased, but the cost of a car, the increase in the cost of a car because of the microchip increase is ridiculous. So the price supply shock aspect cannot explain the very high car prices that we observe. And the high unemployment and recession predicted by most of the heterodox economists that was saying that the tightening was premature and excessive also did not happen, so-called soft landing. Now, my point is that in order to understand all these things, we have to understand what I call the quantity supply shock. They were right that it is supply shocks that are very important. But there is the kind of supply shock that happens that you could not produce the cars because it did not have circulating capital inputs. And at the same time, fiscal policy and other things, people had a lot of money and they wanted to buy cars. What's the difference between this and the price supply shock? Is that this is not independent of how much money people have to buy cars. So there is a role for demand, not in the labor market, but in the goods market, because of a shortage of inputs, and even capacity utilization, this utilization of fixed capital was not high, not because we could not have the machines operating at a higher rate. It's just because we didn't have the inputs to do it. It's not selling cars, not having the inputs. Now, with this little, just taking this into account, you can understand better what happened and understand the role of the both fiscal and monetary policies. So, unlike price supply shocks, which increase are independent of domestic demand, the extent to which prices increase as a result of quantity supply shocks does depend on aggregate demand. And this was aggravated by the shift in the composition of demand towards goods at the end of the pandemic. So just to conclude, because I'm running out of time, let's jump for the implications for the both fiscal and monetary policy. That's the key point. Like, take into account there was a shock. The shock took a lot of time to go through. It's a very different shock. People are not used to it. Like, for instance, prices of cars normally enter in core inflation because they're not volatile. So they think, core inflation must be demand inflation. Yes, there was a demand, but not permanent scarcity. So the implication for what happened in monetary and fiscal policy. In monetary policy, it's very important to understand a large difference between the Fed rhetoric and the practice. Contrary to the impression it gave in its announcement, the Fed did not abandon the new framework. It raised significantly nominal interest rate and real ex-ante interest rates based on expected inflation, but not so much the exposed real interest rate, which is relevant to people who are actually in debt, don't pay anything but your expected income. Now, as a consequence, of course, housing investments slowed down. And there was a moderation of the growth of aggregate demand. This, together with the end of the supply constraints and the partial inflation persist, led to the following inflation. Oh my God, it's always with a single L. So it's written there wrong. But mainly because of the large fiscal stimulus packages, aggregate demand in the US economy has kept growing, and the level of unemployment remained low. So the tightening cannot be said to have been excessive or premature. Finally, one second, the fiscal policy. In what regards fiscal policy, part of the inflation was indeed a collateral effect of the various pensionary stance due to the quantitative supply shock. In fact, the inflationary effects of the needed pensionary fiscal policy could perhaps only have been mitigated if the policies were more targeted by using vouchers, as done in China, directing the spending towards the sectors that needed it could expand output. But that in the West is like not easy to do. But without something like that, there is a dilemma. Either there is a large fiscal stimulus that restores growth quickly, but at the cost of some inflation that will not be permanent, or the stimulus is made substantially smaller in order to try to avoid that inflation. But output and employment would have grown much less during the recovery. So finally, a temporary surge in inflation does seem to have been worth it, given the difficult circumstances and the very good growth and employment performance. And I think we have to thank the pre-pandemic empirical and theoretical academic criticism of the NIRO and the new consensus for making this policy response possible. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, Nathalie, sorry. Let me just
Não, mas assim, tá completo, não falta um pedaço. O problema não é quando você pula mal, aí fica.
Vai ter que mover.
Não, é aí, lá. Essas não esquecem elas. Eu vou qualquer vez. Foi demais, foi demais. Deixa eu colocar nessa frase. Excessivo. Foi. Não, então, contra os Estados Unidos.
Será que eu consigo colocar no computador?
Consegue.
We are on wait, but your computer or your because the computer creates a whole problem with the Zoom and whatnot. Why don't you present? I know it screws up the order, but I'll troubleshoot with her and you present. I think that's the best given the time that we have. So
okay, thank you. Not expecting, there are some links that could be useful, but let's try. Well, so Franklin talked about the monetary policy in US, and as the Fed, the interest rate set by Fed has some implications for emerging and all the countries around the world that use dollar as the international currency. And Nathalie will talk about the consequence in terms of debt and for emerging economies in general. And I will talk about some implications for a specific country, which is Brazil. So what happened, for example, in the 80s when there was a huge increase in interest rate in the US by Volcker. And then you had a lot of emerging economies like Mexico, Brazil, etc., with a lot of problems with external debt, and then with very low growth rates of GDP, high unemployment, high inflation, etc. So we could expect this to happen again with the increase in interest rates like that. But it didn't happen, as Nathalie said, for a very large group of emerging economies. They didn't face problems with external debt. And Brazil didn't have external problems since 2022, when there was increased interest rate by the Fed. And in fact, Brazilian economy grew much more these 2 years, 23, 24, than the previous period. No, the difference was more or less 3.5% now, it's 2 years. Average per year, to 0.2, like more or less in stagnation when the policy by the Fed was very low. So we can see in this graph is the unemployment rate, which was much higher in pre-interest rate increase by the Fed than now. So that the unemployment rate is the lowest levels as the historical series, more or less 6%, the end of 24. So what happened here is that the very important thing just have to mention is the role of fiscal policy, which Franklin mentioned for the US, and the role of minimum wage and its relation with aggregate demand expansion. So the first thing we can note is that fiscal policy was much more expansionary in 2003-24 than before. It's not because of what happens in here in US, much more related to political shifts in Brazil. There's a more right-wing government in the previous period. And then now the Workers' Party again and start in 2003 with Lula, the comeback of Lula. What happens that the minimum wage start to increase again in real terms from 2023. The real wage was frozen in previous period. And it's very important there because a lot of transfers from poor households and for pensions, etc., they are related to the minimum wage. It's more or less almost 20% of the GDP. So it means that when you increase real minimum wage, it increases transfers to households and increase consumption. And this in the end is very important to growth. So here, I think we cannot see all the data because there's a video in the very crucial the GDP, but this is the period 2015-2022. And you can see that all the indicators of fiscal policy were growing in negative terms. They were decreasing. So it was a fiscal contraction from 2015 to 2022. That will help me. And then we moved to a much more expansionary fiscal stance. And I would like to mention here this data on public transfers in real terms that grew 9% in 2023 and 5.1%. Huge demand expansion, and this makes a lot of difference in terms of growth and employment, etc. Even if the US, the interest rate in US increased in this period, it was possible to do this kind of policy and to grow on. So now we can talk about monetary policy and aggregate demand expansion. So here there's a problem that I'll mention after, but monetary policy, okay. Monetary policy was much more contractionary, or interest rate is higher 23, 24 that it was in 2015. So if you look here, this is the real interest rate, like the rate set by the central bank in Brazil and divided by inflation. It was negative in the pandemic. Okay, it was more or less -4%. If you look at the of all the historical data, it was much lower than all the previous and the after. And as you saw, the growth rates were much lower in this period than now. This period, but the interest rate, real interest rate is much higher, 23, 24. So what happened here is that this higher real interest rate didn't burden so much the growth rate. And and then in 2015-22, the lower interest rate was not enough to stimulate economy. So why was that? Because there was no enough. The sensitive of interest rates to growth, not so it depends on a lot of things like indebtedness of families, if the job market is more formalized or not, and a lot of things that happen in this period. And in the end, the very low interest rates just led to small increases in consumption, credit consumption, and residential investment, and didn't lead to a lot of business investment by firms. Because in the end, I think Matthias talked a lot about this. In the end, the growth rate of GDP is much more important to investment. And at that time, the growth rate of GDP was zero. The economy was in stagnation. But what we can add here is that monetary policy is not so important to this direct effect on credit and output expansion, but the nominal interest rate is important because it's very difficult for an emerging economy like Brazil to set interest rates lower than US interest rates. So if what Brazil must do is more or less to follow the interest rate set by the Fed with some margin, some spread to avoid capital outflows, etc. And this kind of capital outflows can lead to changes in the nominal exchange rate, the relation between Brazilian currency and the dollar. And in the end, this can explain inflation. If you had a lot of depreciation, and in the end, you can have a worsening in distribution. In the last 2 minutes, I'll show maybe 3 graphs. What happened here is that when Brazil, the Brazilian central bank tried to stimulate very much the economy through monetary policy and not by fiscal policy, it set the interest rates below the interest rate by the Fed. It led to an outflow of capital and to a large exchange rate depreciation, which combined to the commodities inflation that had Ukraine shocks, etc., led to a very high of 50% shock in a year of these very important goods. And then it led to a very high inflation. And then if you look at this data in all the historical times, these very high rates of inflation are associated with periods in which the exchange rate depreciates very quickly. So in the end, what are the distributive consequence that the real wage, which was growing very much in the 2000, etc., then stagnated in the 2010, and with this shock in commodities plus the shock in exchange rate, the real wages decreased in level. And now the good news is that the real wages are increasing, but still very low, lower than 10%, 5% above in 2024 than the level it was in 2020. Okay, so I finish here. Thank you.
I'm gonna try to log in or
Share my screen from the Zoom.
I have to go let me change here the thing so we can share the screen. I'll stop the share here, I suppose. And hello. Can you share your screen from there? Yes, you can. Look at the technology. So you just bring your, I think you can, so I don't know if you bring it here. I don't know what happened. Which?
Telegraph.
There we go.
Telegraph.
Don't move.
Yes. Okay, so I hope I can make this. You can see it. Yeah.
Yes. I cannot see you. I have to move.
Okay, sorry.
No, it's okay.
Well,
Just kidding,
Probably
it's the
people won't
thing,
see
yeah.
me. Okay. Yeah, so I'm gonna zoom out a little bit and talk about developing economies external debt. Just for a context. So what I wanted to debate here is, or like have a conversation with the recent policy debates involving the so-called debt burden. So we have seen a lot in the news, the discussion of lack of fiscal space in developing economies, especially after the pandemic, when these economies had to increase spending. And at the same time, as Franklin showed, we had an increase in the US interest rate, which serves as a base rate for external borrowing. So the IMF uses the US interest rate as a base rate. All external lending is based on this rate. So combined with increased in spending over the pandemic, there has been this discussion of another systemic debt crisis in developing economies. So what I want to do here is to present some recent trends in this economy's external debt that will helpfully contribute to the debate. So when we look at debt levels, so the first graph on the left is the public and privately guaranteed debt over GNI, and the other is over exports. So when we look at these two indicators on levels of external debt, they don't look historically high compared to the average historical level, which is the gray line. But what we do see in the data is a recent surge in short-term debt. So on the left here, we have short-term debt over reserves in low income and low and middle income countries. And over here, we have total debt service, so interest and amortization over exports on this economy. So we have seen a recent surge, but still not so high compared to the levels that were present in the 2000s, when we had this whole debt relief initiatives for many of these economies. So looking more closely at the composition of this external debt in developing economies, what we do see is an increased participation of multilateral banks in the 2000s. So maybe I can just show this. So in this side here, we see an increase in multilateral creditors in contrast to bilateral lending. So multilateral have increased, but the concessional part of this multilateral lending has not increased that much. On the other hand, debt owed to private lenders has also surpassed the debt of bilateral. and this has been focused on bond issuance. So here we have the increase of private creditors in blue. So surprising, increasing more than private official creditors lending. And this has been concentrated in bonds. So what this can mean is that we have seen an increase in supply of foreign currency to developing economies, but this can also result in a higher average interest rate, so an increased cost and shorter maturity. And what this also means is that we have recently seen an exceptional heterogeneity of creditors by historical standards. So in the 80s, when developing economies had to renegotiate, they mostly concentrated with commercial banks. Now they have to manage this different type of creditors, which can complicate sovereign debt workouts and restructuring process. So when we look at this bond issuance in developing economies, we can divide it into two main groups of countries. The first are emerging market economies, so they are mostly upper middle income developing economies that integrated over the 90s on this left side. But more recently, we have seen mainly low and lower middle income countries integrating after the 2008. So when, for instance, Brazil and Argentina, Mexico will be in the emerging markets, and Ghana, Kenya, Belize will be on the frontier market economies. So when we look at these different country groups, we can see different dynamics on the bond spreads, and which helps explain the difference in the current debt crisis landscape. So during COVID, we see like this huge spike. So blue lines are, I don't know how well you can see it, but blue lines are mostly emerging market economies, and gray lines are frontier market economies bonds. During COVID, we saw a surge. The Ukrainian war also provoked another spike, and during the Fed tightening as well. But what we have seen is many emerging market economies have recovered in a way when we talk about bond straps. So they have largely seen their spread revert to the pre-COVID levels, but this has not been the case on some frontier market economies that are currently in that distress. Another interesting fact on external debt composition of these economies is what has been labeled as a reduction of the original sin. So traditionally, when we looked at the data, there was an overlap between two different definitions of external debt. One based on ownership, so who owns the debt? If it's a non-residence owning this debt, it will be defined as external debt. And another definition is on the currency of denomination. If your debt is denominated in foreign currency, regardless of who owns it, that will be considered external debt. So usually these two definitions overlap because foreigners used to lend mostly in foreign currency. But recently, these foreigners have been increasing their investment in local currency denominated bonds in developing economies. So what this graph shows is that this overlap does not necessarily occur anymore in many developing economies. But again, this is different when we look at these two different country groups. So while this is true for many emerging market economies, it's not or is less relevant for frontier market economies. And there's also a divergence between how saved assets these two different groups of economies have. So what we see that both economies have increased their foreign asset reserves, emerging markets have been doing that at a much higher pace than frontier market economies. And when we look at external debt denominated in foreign currency over reserved, we see also a difference between the pattern among these two types of economies. So the point that I wanted to make is this also that some frontier markets are at the core of the recent financial crisis. So it's not that as in the 80s that we saw around 40 countries defaulting at the same time. What we have been seeing now is a concentration of crisis among frontier economies, and some emerging economies, maybe, but as far as I know, I think only Argentina and Egypt are on kind of a debt distress. But when we look at frontier market economies, out of 5 developing countries that defaulted between 2000 and 2023, 4 were frontier market economies. So in this table, I just put some of the countries that are either defaulting or are in that restructure. So just to conclude pretty quickly, what this data might show or might raise the question is that the recent external shocks have increased debt levels and highlighted the vulnerabilities of some countries, especially frontier market economies, but many others have been more resilient, especially emerging market economies, with more reserves and domestic currency liabilities. And changes in the composition of external debt have shifted to a more expensive and short-term type of borrower. So in the context of the current worsening in external credit conditions, there has been some rollover challenges in some specific countries, but not a general debt problem in developing economies as a whole. Yeah.
Thank you. So I think there are 2 chairs that you can push so that you guys can sit there and we'll open up for questions. You guys can take down something for it back to you guys. So as a brief, not that perhaps it's needed, but a brief sort of summary, which I think it's what was intended by you guys. It's in the American context, macroeconomic policy sort of worked relatively well, including monetary policy, because they didn't tighten enough and they didn't completely, abandon the reformed, the 2012 sort of reform of the monetary policy framework. Whereas in the context of Brazil, in which they tried to do it sort of more expansionist, it actually failed. And the American sort of moderation also meant that to some extent this did not become an international debt crisis, contrary to what a lot of people say. And I would say, if you go back a year ago, in which I said Argentina was on the verge of being, I've been wrong. So they managed to survive, and I think they will survive. So Argentina is not probably going to default. So interestingly enough, not even Argentina is going to default, which is strange. We default all the time. So just for clarification. So I'll open up for questions and comments. Whatever you guys want. All stunned. Yes, awesome.
Thank you for the great discussion. I just want to ask you how you summarize again how Summers and others were wrong and right, but wrong certain ways. But the result, they got it right. So for our students, maybe you can open it up a little more. What really happened? So we didn't go into the recession, or maybe in the future we might face one. So some discussion on that would be nice.
So now the thing is, what I wanted to say is that all the things that were said that were wrong with this traditional idle view, this unique equilibrium in the labor market, if you go over it, you're completely wrong. Horrible things happen. It is correct. However, because of this very unusual kind of supply constraint in the US, people who said, no, it's just cost push inflation. So when that entirely right, it's not that Summers was right, because his argument was on the labor market, so completely wrong. And for instance, I didn't have time, but Blanchard, who said that, later wrote with Bernanke of the paper, admitting that nothing to do with the labor market, it was the supply constraints. He didn't make it interact with the fiscal policy as I do it. Yeah, since it was a particular supply shock, it had something to do, some correlation, let's say, with aggregate demand intensity could have been moderated, but not labor market. So numbers, one thing is saying inflation will go up. The other thing is the cause of it. It's completely wrong. Then Summers, when inflation fell, that was the usual, oh, well, it's because the expectation. Finally, the Fed showed that it was tough in minutes, and then magically expectations solved the problem. But this has been criticized, I think, most effectively by Stevens, who, without mentioning someone, said that's similar to my dog Wolfie, that thinks that when he barks at the airplanes, that barking is what prevents the airplane from falling in my house and killing my family. So that's the thing. So now someone saying again, like the problem is someone was completely wrong. But then, unfortunately, there was the election. Right? And now people say, no, he was right, because any inflation or any cause would cause political problems and make the democracy. But this is a confusion because there was just very particular circumstance in which it happened. It was not the inflation that started off. It was not going to happen. Doesn't mean you have to pretend there is an idol that doesn't exist. And yes, that's why we're discussing this, because now, unfortunately,
The lesson is that.
yeah, and the problem is that some aspects, like, lost all the battles, and because Kamala did not deserve, did not get elected, now they want to say he won the war. Him and also Furman, that I didn't have time to say, which is a bit rich.
Yes.
I mean, isn't there also just like a historical precedent for them to try to justify the only policy tool they have, right? They're never gonna say it was a shock. What can you do about a shock? They're not gonna locate it in expectations. We need to keep those stable. So what's left to do? It's to fuck the labor market. You know what I mean? Like, and that's essentially all they go after repeatedly to like legitimize this attack. And even though there's a correlation, they'll just argue causation every time they want. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think ultimately you have to say this. Let's put it in a sort of political economy way. Somehow, even for some people in the Democratic Party, the Biden government was too left-wing. So, because the interesting thing is why someone like Summers, that was originally a new Democrat in the old days, he was responsible for Clinton, the time of Clinton, all that. One of the main people saying fiscal policy doesn't matter. Let's not do that. Then with secular stagnation, he shifts in the more progressive direction. Then suddenly, in the middle of the pandemic, he shifts back. It's not that the inflation happened.
And it wasn't just that it was wrong.
Before the inflation happened, he had already changed. Later, inflation fell. Instead of saying I was wrong, he kept on it. And then
He said
for him,
he said last summer he said the fiscal package was the worst economic mistake in the last 40 years. And then 2 months later, when Kamala was the candidate, says, oh no, these fiscal policies were great.
Yes.
It's the same fiscal policies.
now-
And now they're again a
They
huge
are-
mistake.
yeah. So it's your point that they use the macroeconomic debate to reinforce certain things they want to do anyway, right? Like if you can now imprint in the Democratic Party progressive force that we should be as obsessed with inflation and treat it in the most orthodox way possible, more than the Fed is, because the Fed progress power is a part of my writing this is that people on the left and more progressive or more Keynesian have criticized Powell too much, because actually what he did is consistent with the heterodox and the criticism of the thing. It sounded worse. You know, his bark, speaking of dogs, was much worse than his bite. He waited to see when the shock went down. He did not. And there was fiscal policy pulling one side. You can't compare with Volcker, which was there was no big fiscal expansion together with the increasing interest rates, etc. So this is the debate that should happen, like what really happened, the right lessons. There are, of course, the political problems, but you cannot suddenly, there was this attempt by Summers, to resurrect the Nairo and the new consensus. during the pandemic. They failed, and now they're trying again after Kamala lost. I said, come on, this thing never ends. It looks like this horror movie, but the guy comes from, the great flags. I think your point is correct. They say, well, inflation is horrible. What's the best way to deal with it? Permanent? Attack labor.
Chris.
Yeah, so I've been thinking about the US, future macro policy in terms of US things, but I'm curious about the impact on other countries, because my suspicion is, right, we're worried about inflation rising quite a bit if we cut off all imports and if we, get rid of a bunch of immigrants who are here, those would be very inflationary in the US. Thinking about if the Fed then has to raise interest rates quite a lot, does that create a debt problem for the developing countries, or do you think that they're in a good enough position where they could maybe withstand kind of a rise in US interest rates?
I think I would say that there are countries that are more well equipped than others to deal with that. So of course we have some fragile countries with low reserves, with shorter maturity type of debt that might suffer. But I think at the end of the day, if that's gonna be a real problem, it depends on how they renegotiate the terms of their debt, right? So I think it's not. I think we should look at it at country-specific way. My concern is when we talk about like, oh, the Fed is gonna rise interest rate and then it's gonna be this huge debt problem, it implies that no one can spend anymore. And then we cannot meet the SDG goals, and developing countries are not allowed to make the green transition and other spending that are relevant for growth. But I just think, I'm not saying that's not gonna have problem to anyone, but I just think that there are countries more quality than others.
If I may interject just one thing there. So I tend to think that the Fed will reduce the rate at which they were going to reduce rates. I'm less confident that we're going to have humongous effects on inflation, even if some tariffs and that's the other thing. So if that happened, by the way, a lot of countries would, I think, Summa's part on the discussion is that Brazil has to hike it. If you don't, you're in trouble. You're going to have inflation. And so
the hike here, but if it will happen.
that is necessary. But the key thing is most countries over the last 20 years learn one lesson. You accumulate humongous amounts of reserves. So the only countries that are really in trouble are those with very low levels of reserves. And that's the handful of countries you were suggesting, Argentina, Egypt, the countries with embargoes, Venezuela, Iran, those countries are in trouble.
The big difference between the ages now.
Exactly.
Pool of reserves between and this instability.
Yes, Oslo. I think with that, we close with that and a last comment of.
Nathalie, what is the IMF new take on debt relief or debt restructuring for those countries? I know there's some push, but where are they standing nowadays?
I think like they are so for developing, there is like a huge push for mostly GNOs for a new debt relief initiative, as the one that we saw recently with the DSSA after the pandemic. But I don't see the IMF looking forward to another debt relief for these countries. And that's the whole debate. They have been saying that there's a lot of vulnerability, but I don't see that with their approach is like you have to do austerity. So the whole IMF discussion in this last spring was how countries need to be austere and reduce the debt levels themselves. Yeah, nothing changed.
I think that's it. Well, thank you very much for coming.